So we've been having conversations about security challenges facing the international system, and I think it's important to talk about weapons of mass destruction as one of those threats or security challenges that really has dominated a lot of the discourse and conversation around security in the post Cold War period. And so when we're talking about weapons of mass destruction, I want to first differentiate between how WMD is used under US law and how it's used when we're thinking about international politics. So in the context of international politics, WMD, weapons of mass destruction, refers to this class of weapons that are considered taboo in part because they are largely indiscriminate in that they don't really make a distinction between civilians and combatants in the way that we typically expect military force to do when we're thinking about the just conduct of war. And we'll talk about just war theory later on in a different discussion. But for now, I think it's worth just acknowledging that when we're talking about this in the context of international politics, we're talking about chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. That's what constitutes WMD. If you're in the United States and you follow the news closely, periodically you're going to hear somebody charged with, having WMD or attempting to deploy a weapon of mass destruction. Typically, what they're talking about in that context is a pipe bomb. A pipe under U.S. law, anything that is non-discriminate is as a weapon is considered a weapon of mass destruction, which is a little bit different than we typically would think about when we're thinking about international politics, but there's a common element of that not being able to target precisely who you're hitting, not being able to have a kind of conversation about whether the military value of a strike outweighs the potential loss of civilian life that's sort of required by the Geneva Convention as you're thinking about targeting in a military context. Okay, so we've got WMD as indiscriminate weapons. How indiscriminate, how destructive these things are? Well, there's really a range when we think about all of these different categories, right? Nuclear weapons. On the upper end, we have hydrogen bombs, which can wipe out cities, but nuclear also includes just a dirty bomb where you just pack radioactive material that's maybe medical waste or industrial waste and explode it in an urban center, and it creates so much havoc and chaos that that it maybe shuts down the city for weeks or months. In terms of fatalities, you might see an increase in birth defects, you might see an increase in cancer, but it's not even in the same ballpark really as a hydrogen bomb where that city simply disappears. When we think about chemical weapons, we might run the gamut from a military grade tear gas at the low end all the way up to VX nerve gas, where just a tiny droplet is enough to kill a person, incredibly deadly poison. And then biological, can again run the gamut from smallpox or the bubonic plague at sort of the upper end of deadliness, down to anthrax, which has been deployed as a biological weapon and did indeed kill a couple people, as well as salmonella. There was a use of salmonella as a biological weapon by a terrorist group. It was sort of a religious cult that tried to take over a small town back in the 80s by dumping salmonella into the post-church salad bar to sicken the community and therefore depress voter turnout at an upcoming election where this group was hoping to seize control of the organs of the local government. But again, right, so that's awful, but nowhere near the level of destructiveness that I think is conjured when we think about weapons of mass destruction. So in addition to the range of sort of deadliness that gets captured by this umbrella term of weapon of mass destruction, there's also a lot of differences about different types of weapons in terms of deploying them and in terms of acquiring them. If you want to get your hands on just radioactive material, it's relatively easy. Again, there's lots of radioactive stuff around in medical facilities and in industrial facilities. If you want to get your hands on something more dangerous, large amounts of uranium. That's going to be more of a challenge. That tends to be fairly closely monitored. It tends to be fairly closely regulated. If you want to get your hands on weapons grade uranium or plutonium, that's going to be borderline impossible. This tends to be very tightly controlled, only found in research labs with high security and military facilities, so much harder to get a hold of, although not impossible. There have been cases of people smuggling material out from research labs and manufacturing facilities, military manufacturing facilities. Biological and chemical weapons, there's a lot of variability in terms of how hard it is to get your hands on things. Salmonella is widely available. Most biological weapons require some level of laboratory setup to be able to grow and cultivate. Chemical weapons tend to require, again, some laboratory space to be able to develop. Getting the sort of original strains to weaponize, again, if you're thinking Salmonella, that's available in chicken. If you want to get your hands on smallpox, again, smallpox only exists in laboratories and is generally highly controlled and highly contained. It doesn't exist out in the world as a live strain that you could get access to. This is normally where I flagged that at one point the Center for Disease Control actually found smallpox in a closet that they had kind of forgotten about. It was just in a box. So no human system is perfect, but by and large you would have to have pretty good access to be able to get to the most dangerous levels of these kind of weapons. There's also a challenge of being able to deploy these weapons effectively, simply because you have access to the kind of things that you would need to be able to create a weapon of mass destruction. Doesn't mean that you're going to actually be able to turn it into something that's as deadly as I think people imagine when they think about weapons of mass destruction. So biological agents can be very difficult to weaponize. There was in 2001 a series of anthrax attacks in which somebody was sending letters full of white powder with anthrax in it to members of Congress and to I think journalists also were targeted. It was traced back to an individual, I believe, although I don't know that this individual was ever prosecuted, who had been working on the weaponization of anthrax for the United States government, and actually had the knowledge to be able to turn anthrax into a really deadly weapon. But most of the people who came in contact with anthrax in the 2001 attack didn't die, in part because in order to make anthrax deadly, you have to create spores and of a certain size. If they're too small, you breathe them in and you breathe them out and you don't get infected. If they're too large, you breathe them in, but they get stuck in your lungs, not deep enough to actually cause an infection. So it requires a pretty sophisticated understanding of a disease to be able to turn it into something that is going to cause a mass or widespread infection. Likewise, some chemical weapons require really sophisticated technology to be able to deploy effectively and require oftentimes a lot of testing. In the 1990s, there was a cult in Japan that attempted to get access to uranium to build a nuclear bomb. They tried to buy some land in Australia thinking that they could mine their own and enrich it. Enriching uranium to weapons grade is incredibly expensive and requires a lot of energy and a lot of time and a lot of specialized knowledge. So that instead they opted to work with some chemists and develop VX nerve gas, and they deployed it. Their mechanism for deploying it was to bring it onto the subways in Tokyo in backpacks with jars of VX nerve gas, and then to sort of set the backpacks and jars on the subway onto the seat and unscrew the lids. And while VX nerve gas is incredibly deadly and the death toll could have been unimaginable from the quantity of VX nerve gas they had, VX nerve gas doesn't evaporate quickly, and so it was evaporating out into the air in such small doses that thousands of people got sick, very sick, but it wasn't a 1 million person fatality event because of the deployment and not understanding the deployment with the level of sophistication that would probably come with military research. After the Cold War, there was kind of a panic about these idea of suitcase nukes, that these were miniaturized nuclear weapons that the Soviet Union may have developed, that may have been at military facilities, that may have just simply walked out the door in the chaos following the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And for decades, the United States and others kind of scoured through international black markets and arms deals trying to find suitcase nukes. This was oftentimes presented as this like nightmare scenario because anybody could essentially wheel one of these things into the downtown of a city and blow it up, and there'd be no way to know and almost no way to stop these things. It's been 30 years of searching, and as far as I know, no suitcase nukes have surfaced. So that may have been an example of imagining worst case scenarios and preparing against them rather than a genuine threat that we were having to manage. But it gets to something that I think is a big part of how people think about weapons of mass destruction as something that might come into contact with terrorist organizations who might use them to cause really unimaginable destruction. In fact, after September 11th, this was framed as the worst case scenario by the Bush administration and justified going after any state with any link to terrorism that might have shown an inclination for weapons of mass destruction. I am of the view, and I'll defend this a little bit with reference to a guy named Tom Schelling, that the threat from terrorism and weapons of mass destruction is probably overblown. That oftentimes the technical requirements, the access requirements, the cost really makes weapons of mass destruction prohibitive for terrorist groups, even well-financed terrorist groups, that they just oftentimes don't have access to the kind of things that they would need to be able to produce weapons of mass destruction. And so we have very few instances of terrorist groups using weapons of mass destruction. We have the salmonella attack on a salad bar. We have the VX nerve gas attack on the Tokyo subway system. We have ISIS using chemical weapons, including chlorine gas, during the Syrian civil war against civilians. It was a horrific example, but it was something that came out of poison gas being used as part of that war. And again, something that they were able to get access to as part of controlling territory within Syria, rather than something that a typical terrorist organization would really have access to and would be able to deploy in a battlefield type scenario, because most terrorist groups don't fight in battlefield type scenarios. Most terrorist groups find that it's cost effective to just simply use what's available. And so they use conventional weapons, they use explosives, they use them in very creative ways, but they're not relying upon weapons of mass destruction. And Tom Schelling, who really was one of the great minds behind nuclear strategy during the Cold War, initially sort of was very concerned about terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, but eventually came to think that maybe the threat was largely overblown, even if the access and even if the technical requirements were overcome. And so the scenario he kind of sketches out as a thought experiment is of a terrorist organization that's able to get its hands on weapons-grade uranium and is able to build a bomb, right? Building a bomb, however, is still a technical task. They're able to source the people to do it. They're able to get the space to do it. And they spend months and months and months building this bomb, testing the components, making sure it will work, because they realize they only have enough highly enriched uranium for one explosion. And so it's got to work. And so in the process of designing this bomb, manufacturing this bomb, preparing for the strike, he says that obviously any terrorist organization is going to have a conversation internally about what should be attacked and what's the way to get maximum value out of having a nuclear weapon. And once you use the thing, it's done. It's gone. It no longer functions as a threat. So you really have to maximize the value. I hate saying this in the context of a terrorist organization, but like a terrorist organization is trying to get something from that bomb, what would be the best way to do it? And they're going to brainstorm, and they're going to realize that there's not a lot that they can get just by simply blowing stuff up. If they want to blow something up, maybe they can use it as a decapitation strike and hit a capital, but the likelihood that that's actually going to end a government and there won't be retaliation, and it seems unlikely. But maybe it would work as a threat, right? If you have specific policy goals, things that you're trying to achieve, maybe simply having a nuclear weapon is enough. Maybe you don't use it. Maybe you trade it for concessions, or you hold on to it in exchange for concessions. And he sort of sketches through how this might work and how you could put out a threat. You could post photos of yourself with a weapon. You could invite government officials to be kidnapped, brought in, verify that yes, this is a real weapon and a real threat, and then pass along your list of demands. And that would be a reasonably effective strategy for a terrorist organization that acquired a nuclear weapon, and probably the optimal strategy, according to Schelling's thought experiment, for how a terrorist organization would use that kind of technology if it were able to get access to it, use it as a bargaining chip rather than as a weapon. I'm not sure everybody agrees with Schelling's sort of calculation on how this would play out, but I think it's certainly important to ask that question, right? Strategically, what would make the most sense? How would a terrorist organization think about accomplishing its goals, and how would a nuclear weapon factor into that? And I'm not sure that it's quite as clear-cut of a case as maybe was assumed in the wake of September 11th, that a terrorist organization with access to nuclear weapons would immediately want to use them and immediately want to strike with them, rather than thinking about some other strategy for using them.